I've never seen a federal courtroom this tense. Cameras were rolling, analysts were live tweeting every breath, and Pam Bondi stood at the center like a storm about to strike. The hearing was supposed to be routine, a high-profile ethics review involving Bondi's advisory work on a recent federal case. But from the moment Judge John D. Bates leaned forward with that familiar smirk, everyone knew he had other plans. "Ms. Bondi," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "perhaps you should clarify for the court why your recommendations appear to mirror those of certain politically motivated donors." The audience stirred. Bondi didn't blink. Instead, she slowly reached for a folder beside her. "Your Honor," she said, voice cool, "I came here today prepared to defend my integrity, but I wasn't expecting to have to defend it from you." Bates narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me." Pam opened the folder. "This morning, I received a packet, anonymously, of course. It contains records, sealed transcripts, and payments, all tied to your rulings in 2016 and 2018. Shall we read them aloud, Your Honor, or submit them into evidence?" Gasps filled the room. Bates leaned back as if someone had gut-punched him. And that's when everything changed. For a split second, Judge Bates looked like he'd seen a ghost. His fingers twitched toward the gavel, but he didn't strike it. Pam Bondi held up the packet like it was a bomb, and in a way, it was. "I tried to ignore it," she continued, her voice calm but razor-sharp. "I assumed it was a smear. But then I saw your signature, Judge Bates. Multiple times. On backdated orders, on redacted wire transfers, and, most curiously, on 2 rulings tied directly to corporate lobbyists whose names appear in your private communications." "You're out of order," Bates barked, rising halfway from his chair. Pam didn't flinch. "No, you're out of order. And the country deserves to know why a sitting federal judge, appointed to interpret justice, has quietly built a web of favors behind closed doors." The room buzzed. Reporters scrambled to type. The stenographer's hands moved like lightning. Meanwhile, Bondi walked calmly to the evidence table and laid the packet down. "I formally request these documents be entered into the congressional record under whistleblower protocol. Redactions included, for now." Judge Bates' face drained of color. "I suggest we proceed," Pam said, looking straight into the cameras now. "Unless you'd like to step down before this goes any further." No one said a word. Then, the silence was broken, not by the judge, but by the clap of someone in the gallery. The solitary clap echoed like a gunshot in the courtroom's high ceilings. Another followed. Then another. And before long, half the gallery was applauding, not out of disrespect for the court, but because they understood what just happened. Someone had pulled back the curtain on one of Washington's untouchables. Judge Bates's eyes darted to the bailiff, then to the clerk, as if begging for control. But control was already gone. "Ms. Bondi," he said finally, attempting to regain his composure, "you are dangerously close to contempt." Pam tilted her head slightly. "Only if telling the truth is now considered contempt, Your Honor." Bates gripped the bench with both hands. "You're grandstanding." Pam stepped forward. "No. I'm exposing. For years, people have whispered about your ties to shadow firms in Northern Virginia, about your closed-door meetings with lobbying entities right before controversial rulings. But now there's documentation. Courtroom footage. Phone logs. You tried to shame me with accusations that don't stick, while hiding skeletons that rattle every time you speak." Gasps again. Someone in the media row whispered, "She's got him." Bates looked to the clerk. "We're going into recess." But before he could rise, Pam raised one hand. "Motion to deny recess," she said. "On the grounds that the judge himself may be implicated in matters directly related to this hearing. I request a neutral adjudicator moving forward." And just like that, the courtroom was no longer his. The courtroom fell into chaos. Attorneys on both sides exchanged frantic whispers. Journalists in the press row were texting so furiously it sounded like rainfall. And Judge Bates, usually the picture of authority, sat frozen, jaw clenched, unable to hide the tremor in his hand. Pam stood tall, unfazed. "I repeat," she said clearly, "this hearing cannot proceed under a judge who may be subject to investigation related to the very ethics he claims to uphold." Judge Bates finally spoke, but his voice had lost its usual thunder. "You don't have the authority to make that motion." Pam stepped closer. "Actually, I do. Under Section 455 of the U.S. Code, any federal judge shall disqualify himself in any proceeding in which his impartiality might reasonably be questioned." She let the quote hang in the air. "I'd say a sealed wire transfer to a defense contractor before a favorable ruling counts." Murmurs of "she's right" rippled through the courtroom. From the rear, a new voice cut in, sharp, official. "I represent the House Oversight Committee," the woman said, standing. "We've just received a copy of the evidence packet. We are moving to open a formal inquiry into Judge Bates's financial history and rulings. Effective immediately." All eyes snapped to her. Judge Bates turned pale. "You can't do that here." The woman held up her badge. "Actually, we can. And we just did." Pam Bondi crossed her arms. "I came here ready to defend myself. I didn't expect to have to defend the system too. But if that's what it takes, I'm ready." For the first time in decades, the power in that courtroom shifted, and it was no longer in the judge's hands. Judge Bates looked like he might be sick. His carefully curated legacy, built over decades behind closed doors, was now unraveling in real time, and there wasn't a single ally in sight to save him. The House Oversight representative walked toward the bench, holding up a tablet. "We have digital verification," she said. "Banking trails linked to a shell company in Delaware. Several payments coincide with rulings in 3 separate high-profile cases." Pam added, "And the whistleblower who provided this? Former clerk. Your former clerk. Who says he was threatened with career blacklisting if he ever spoke out." The judge's lips parted slightly, as if to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. "Your Honor," said another voice, this time from a Department of Justice liaison seated quietly at the back. "We recommend you recuse yourself immediately and await the findings of the investigation. If you refuse, we'll file an emergency injunction to halt all proceedings under your jurisdiction." Now it was official. Bates had lost the bench, and everyone in the room knew it. He slumped back into his seat, staring out blankly. "Fine," he muttered. "I recuse." The gavel that had once struck fear into attorneys and officials now sat untouched beside him, meaningless. Pam Bondi didn't gloat. She didn't smile. Instead, she walked to the center of the room and said, "This hearing was meant to question my integrity. But justice doesn't start with finger-pointing. It starts with accountability, even at the highest levels." The silence that followed was heavy. Historic. Because no one watching would ever forget the day Pam Bondi stood alone, and brought a federal judge to his knees. Outside the courthouse, a storm of reporters surged forward, lights flashing, microphones reaching like claws. But Pam Bondi didn't rush. She descended the marble steps slowly, calmly, as if she'd just walked out of a boardroom, not a legal battleground. A young journalist called out, "Ms. Bondi. Did you know the judge would recuse himself today?" Pam paused, adjusted the single folder she still carried under her arm, and answered plainly. "I didn't come to destroy anyone," she said. "I came to defend the truth. But when someone in power tries to twist that truth for their own protection, they leave me no choice." Another reporter jumped in. "Do you think Judge Bates will face charges?" Pam glanced at the courthouse doors behind her. "That's not up to me. That's up to the system he tried to manipulate." At that moment, sirens began to echo faintly in the distance. A motorcade, not Bates's, but the DOJ's, pulled up to the curb. Inside the building, a marshal quietly served papers, marking the beginning of a full-scale investigation into one of the most revered judges in the D.C. Circuit. Pam turned back to the crowd. "This isn't personal," she said. "This is institutional. And if it can happen with him, it can happen with others." Her phone buzzed. A message from a Senate aide read, "House committee wants you to testify next week. Unanimous request." Pam didn't reply. She looked out across the sea of cameras and said just one thing, "Let this be a message: no robe, no title, no seat on the bench makes anyone untouchable." And with that, she walked straight through the crowd. Not a politician. Not a prosecutor. But the woman who just changed everything. By the time Pam reached her office, the internet was on fire. Clips from the courtroom had already gone viral, edited, subtitled, dissected frame by frame. News anchors across networks were running wall-to-wall coverage. Hashtags like hashtag Bondi breaks the bench and hashtag Bates exposed trended #1 within the hour. Inside her office, Pam slid the now famous folder onto her desk and sat down, her expression unreadable. She wasn't celebrating. She was strategizing. A soft knock at the door. "Come in," she said. It was her aide, Melanie, holding a tablet. "They've scheduled you for 2 closed-door briefings tomorrow. Judiciary and ethics oversight. And, you're being asked to lead a bipartisan task force on judicial accountability." Pam raised an eyebrow. "Already? They want you on the Sunday shows too. CNN, Fox, Meet the Press, they're all calling." Pam leaned back in her chair. "Let them call." Melanie hesitated. "Are you okay?" Pam looked toward the window, where Capitol Hill loomed in the distance like a stone colossus. "I didn't set out to take down a judge," she said. "But maybe it's time we stop pretending they can't fall." A long silence passed before Melanie added, "There's one more thing." A staffer from Bates's chamber anonymously submitted a second batch of files. Confidential emails. Travel logs. Apparently, he wasn't just taking money. He was meeting with defense attorneys in private, sometimes before rulings were even issued. Pam stood up. Her jaw tightened. "It's worse than we thought." She picked up the new file, thumbed it open, and her eyes narrowed. "I hope Judge Bates enjoyed his seat on the bench," she said coldly. "Because now he's going to be sitting somewhere else." The contents of the second file were damning, far beyond what even Pam had anticipated. Dozens of email threads revealed a tangled web. Judge Bates had coordinated secret pre-ruling meetings with elite defense firms, many of whom had quietly funneled money through consulting grants to nonprofits tied to his family name. But what truly broke the mold? A 2019 thread between Bates and a corporate attorney who flat-out drafted language that later appeared, nearly word for word, in one of Bates's official rulings. Pam stared at the screen. "This isn't corruption," she muttered. "It's choreography." Within hours, her legal team forwarded everything to both the House Oversight Committee and the Inspector General's office. They didn't even wait to redact the names. That evening, Pam appeared on live television, not for a victory lap, but for a reckoning. She sat across from a primetime host who asked, "Pam, some say this was personal. That you had a grudge against Judge Bates. Is that true?" Pam didn't blink. "If I have a grudge, it's against the illusion of accountability in Washington." And today, that illusion cracked. She leaned forward slightly. "This isn't about Bates alone. He's just the first. There are more. People in robes, in boardrooms, in positions of public trust, who think their title protects them from scrutiny. That era is over." The host paused. "Are you planning to run for office?" Pam smiled, just barely. "I'm not running for anything. I'm uncovering something." The screen cut to black with her final words still echoing. And behind the scenes, Judge Bates was already packing up his chambers, not voluntarily. The judiciary had quietly placed him on administrative leave pending a full ethics investigation. By Friday morning, the federal courthouse was a fortress. Reporters camped outside as U.S. Marshals escorted boxes from Judge Bates's office, boxes labeled not by his clerks, but by federal investigators. Word had leaked overnight, the FBI was now involved, and a grand jury had been quietly impaneled. Pam Bondi arrived at the Capitol just after 9 a.m., invited to testify in front of a joint closed-door session between the House Judiciary and Oversight Committees. But the reception she received wasn't political, it was almost reverent. Several lawmakers stood as she entered. A senior Democrat whispered, "You did what none of us dared to." Pam nodded politely. She wasn't here for applause. Inside the chamber, the questions began. Direct. Unforgiving. From both sides. How long have you had access to the initial documents? What made you decide to go public? Do you believe other judges are compromised? Pam answered each one with precision. No speculation. Just facts. She didn't inflate the story, she didn't have to. The evidence spoke louder than spin. Then came the final question from a Republican committee member: if it hadn't been you, if you hadn't challenged him, what would have happened to that evidence? Pam paused. It would have stayed buried. And a man in a robe would have kept issuing rulings from a seat of fraud. The silence in the room was profound. Later that day, a draft resolution was introduced to establish a federal Judicial Integrity Commission, with Pam Bondi listed as a founding advisor. Outside, when asked what her next move would be, Pam offered only 6 words: cleaning house isn't a part-time job. That weekend, the tides turned completely. Major newspapers that had once featured glowing editorials about Judge Bates now published front-page exposés. Headlines read, "The Bench Betrayed, Inside the Hidden Dealings of Judge John D. Bates, Bondi's Bombshell, How One Woman Dismantled a Judicial Empire." Sunday morning shows were dominated by clips from Pam's testimony. Former federal prosecutors called it a turning point for judicial accountability. One legal analyst on national television said bluntly, "Bondi did more in 3 days than internal watchdogs have done in 30 years. Meanwhile, in Washington's elite legal circles, panic was spreading. Whispers of other judges with ties to Bates's network, of undisclosed retreats, private arbitration favors, and sealed settlements, began to surface. It was the ripple effect Pam had expected. She met with her team late Sunday evening, standing in front of a board cluttered with photos, case numbers, and names. "We start here," she said, pointing to a list of judges who had shared dockets or donors with Bates. "We don't stop at exposure. We follow the funding. Every coincidence, every overlap, every backdoor conversation." Her lead investigator looked up. "What if they come after you now?" Pam didn't hesitate. "They already tried." She tapped the folder, now locked in a secure case, that had started it all. "Only difference now. I'm not alone." Behind her, a network of reformers, lawyers, clerks, and even sitting members of Congress had quietly aligned. It wasn't just Pam's crusade anymore. It was a movement. Monday morning, Judge Bates made his first and only public appearance since the scandal broke. Flanked by 2 attorneys, he stepped out of a black SUV and into the U.S. District Courthouse through a side entrance, not as a presiding authority, but as a potential defendant. A subpoena had been issued late Sunday night by a federal grand jury convened under the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Section. No robe. No gavel. No power. Inside, Bates declined to answer most questions, invoking his Fifth Amendment rights. But the message was clear: his fall was no longer political theater. It was a legal reality. Back across town, Pam Bondi walked confidently into the office of the newly formed Judicial Integrity Commission. It wasn't ceremonial, the president himself had signed the executive directive approving its oversight powers just hours earlier. The first meeting opened with a simple, unassuming statement from the chairwoman, "Ms. Bondi, we ask that you serve as special advisor to this body, with full access to investigative resources and subpoena authority. Pam glanced at the commission table, 10 men and women, bipartisan, seasoned, and watching her carefully. She answered without hesitation, yes. But understand this, I'm not here for symbolism. I'm here for results. Over the next 2 hours, she laid out a framework. Not just for investigating Bates and his associates, but for systemic reform, financial transparency audits, rotation policies, and whistleblower protection for clerks and lower court staff. By day's end, news broke, 3 more federal judges were now under preliminary review, all linked in some way to the same offshore consulting network. Pam's name was everywhere. But she didn't care about headlines. She cared about something else, making sure this never happened again. Months later, the courthouse that once echoed with Judge Bates's commands now held a very different sound, the quiet, relentless hum of accountability. Bates had officially resigned in disgrace, narrowly avoiding indictment through a plea agreement that stripped him of his pension, barred him from practicing law, and required full cooperation in ongoing investigations. His name, once synonymous with legal authority, had become a cautionary tale. But Pam Bondi wasn't finished. Under her guidance, the Judicial Integrity Commission had completed its first full-scale review, 7 judges recommended for disciplinary hearings, 3 resignations submitted voluntarily, and the implementation of a national registry tracking undisclosed financial conflicts in the judiciary. For the first time in decades, clerks, aides, and junior attorneys were speaking out without fear. Anonymous tips turned into credible leads. Internal memos that once disappeared now landed directly on Pam's desk. During a nationally televised panel, a journalist asked her, "Did you ever think this would go this far?" Pam paused, then answered, "I never thought it would go far enough. But now, we're getting close." She stood for something larger than partisanship or politics, something dangerous to entrenched power, unfiltered truth. In the end, it wasn't a movement built on noise or outrage. It was built on facts, courage, and the refusal to let fear dictate silence. Pam Bondi didn't just expose a corrupt judge. She rewrote the rules of accountability, and left behind a legacy far bigger than the scandal that started it.